I'm really excited to see everyone that's joined us here today and to present the panel on filling and processing needs and building lasting agricultural infrastructure here at the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit. We're here today to talk about the potential for hemp-fed animals. So I will introduce the panelists here in a second. I just wanted to do a few last minute housekeeping items. So each of us is going to do a short presentation, and then what I'd like is for you to submit questions as we go through each of the presentations, but then we will have some time at the end to allow for questions and answers as they pertain to the presentations. And right now we'd like to hear a little bit more about you. So if you can take a second and respond to our quick survey, that would be great. All right, so while we learn a little bit more about you guys, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. My name is Hunter Buffington. I am the executive director for the Hemp Feed Coalition. We have been in existence for just about 3 years now. We were born from Colorado, work with stakeholder groups trying to identify a pathway to legal approval. And I'm really excited to introduce this topic for our attendees today, and then to allow our panelists to take a much deeper dive into the work that they're doing and how that's going to help bring this to fruition. So the first thing that I would like to do is to introduce Miss Erin Bubb. I met Erin through her volunteer work on the board of directors for the Association of American Feed Control Officials, AFCO, where, oops, sorry, hold on, my notes just got overrun there. Where she is a volunteer on the board of directors and was also a feed investigator for miscellaneous products and forage products. She began working at the Pennsylvania Department of Ag in 2000, became a program specialist, and is now the agronomic division chief. Welcome, Erin. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joseph Bender. He's an assistant professor at the Center for Animal Health and Productivity at the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine with a focus on dairy cattle. Since he arrived at Penn Vet in 2013, his work has been providing farm consultation to dairy farmers throughout Pennsylvania to improve production, profitability, and well-being for both dairy cattle and producers. Welcome, Dr. Bender. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to jump in with my presentation now. So bear with me one moment while I pull up that screen. Oops. All right, can everyone see that?
Looks good, Hunter. Just want to hit from beginning.
Okay, excellent. All right. So the first thing that I want to do is to introduce to you the Hemp Feed Coalition and why we formed an organization around this work. That's because currently no animal feed products have been approved to be fed to animals in the United States. There's a number of pathways, and we're going to talk about that as we go further. But in order to gain that legal federal approval, there's a lot of steps, a lot of research and data that has to be gathered in order to present those applications for approval by the FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine. So we knew that there was a need to at least run point on gathering all this information. And we also recognized that there was huge value in the production of hemp and its use as animal feed because of its nutritional profile. The other thing that we wanted to do was to make sure that when people thought about types of animal feed, that they were thinking about hemp and its byproducts that are actively produced from human food market production. So there was a lot of reasons to start an organization. When we began, as I mentioned before, it was born of work from a coalition of stakeholders who were brought together by the Colorado Department of Agriculture to address these issues. And this actually happened because our legislature said that they wanted to pass legislation to approve animal feed. And then once they tried to go down that pathway, they learned very quickly that that is not actually a pathway to legalization, that we can't simply pass laws to allow it. So the objective was to analyze the issues in this stakeholder group and to create a pathway to actually gain that legalization. That report was published in 2018. You can find that in a link on our website if you'd like to learn more information. But it was the conclusion of that group and the fact that we didn't have a pathway forward, next steps, that led to the creation of the Hemp Feed Coalition. One of the reasons that I'm really excited about the coalition is that we're made up of industry partners, not only in the hemp industry, but in the animal feed industry. We work closely with regulators as well as researchers from across the United States and even internationally in Canada. So it's really fantastic to have such diverse expertise coming together to work towards this kind of a goal for the benefit of multiple industries. To that end, you can see a number of our goals here. And the big one, of course, is to gain federal legal approval of hemp as animal feed. It's quite a process. I'm going to let Erin dive into that. But when we began this process, one of the biggest things that we were set to overcome as far as barriers was simply a lack of data generated in the United States. So the need for American grown and American processed certificates of analysis, nutritional composition and contaminant composition is really important to being able to present applications to the FDA CVM for consideration, and in fact, through AFCO. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about for a brief second is that the Hemp Feed Coalition, because we are a coalition made up of industry partners, we are allowed to present a new ingredient definition to AFCO for their consideration and recommendation to FDA CVM. This is our goal, to get it officially approved in the official publication, the OP of AFCO, and thereby our state feed control officials would then be able to feed it. And again, Erin will provide some more information about that. The other secondary goal that we have is the Hemp Feed Coalition.
I think we may have lost you, Hunter. Maybe her internet connection dropped out, possibly. While she's getting back connected, does anyone else want to have a few words?
If anybody had any questions, I know you haven't yet seen the presentations from the panelists, but potentially we could start a conversation and do a little Q&A right now to fill some of the dead air time. I'm sure Dr. Bender and I would both be available to to provide some answers if we can.
Yeah, sure, we can certainly do that.
Yeah, it looks like she must have been having internet problems. I
Mhm.
join as soon as I see her come back in.
Okay. If you would prefer, to the organizers, would it make sense for me to go into my presentation, and then when Hunter gets back on, we can have her finish hers?
Erin, if you want to go ahead, that would be fine.
Sure, we can do that. And then maybe Hunter can find us again, and we can get back to that again. So bear with me as I do a little toggling between screens here. Okay. So if everything went well, you should be looking at a screen right now that has a big green ink blob on it. Dr. Bender, is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, it looks good, Erin.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to work through that at this point. Okay. All right. So I'm going to give you a regulatory perspective. There's a lot of excitement out there in this world of hemp, this world of hemp and hemp byproducts that might be soon entering the marketplace for use in animal feed. I think the one thing that a lot of people didn't understand in the very beginning was that there are very specific processes in place for animal feed ingredients to be recognized and accepted in a legal capacity to be used in animal feed. So basically what we needed, we have research is being completed, and that is helping to determine the safety and the use of hemp as a new livestock and poultry feed. This is definitely what we're going to be discussing on today's panel. In this presentation, I'm going to bring the regulatory perspective of how a new feed ingredient works its way through the review process and finds acceptance as a legally recognized feed ingredient. Materials used as feed ingredients should have the following attributes. They need to be consistent batch to batch. They should not be a combination of other ingredients. And the intended use should not be to mitigate or treat a disease, but rather to provide nutrition, color, taste, or aroma for the animal, or to provide a technical effect in the feed. There are several pathways available for a new feed ingredient. I will talk about two of them today. There's a food additive petition, or we call it an FAP, and AFCO, which Hunter talked about a little bit, which was the Association of American Feed Control Officials. The independent GRAS conclusion is an option, but it is not widely used in the animal feed world like you see in the human food sector. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about that today unless we have some questions at the end where there may be some interest in that particular route. So the AFCO official publication is, let's see here. I need to advance my slides, so give me 1 second. Okay, now we're looking at the red hen. Okay, the AFCO official publication is copyrighted, and it is available for a nominal fee at afco.org. It's updated every year in hard copy and twice a year with the electronic version that is available for a subscription fee. Most state animal feed regulations refer to the AFCO official terms and definitions. And the definitions are comprehensive. They are a list of approved feed ingredients. And honestly, it's the most comprehensive list of recognized and approved animal feed ingredients out there. Food additives used in animal food are characterized based on their composition and their intended use. An animal feed food additive is generally intended to supply nutrients, to add aroma or flavor, to aid stability, or alter a food's characteristics. A manufacturer or other sponsor may petition the FDA for approval of a new animal food additive, or they may petition for a new use of an already approved animal food additive. So to demonstrate that the additive is safe for the proposed use in an animal food, the sponsor submits a food additive petition. And again, we refer to that as an FAP, food additive petition. The FAP must include sufficient information to establish that the food additive is safe and accomplishes its intended use. Now, once that has been demonstrated, FDA can issue a regulation addressing the food additive and its use. So today I'm going to be using the acronym FDA and CVM interchangeably. FDA is the big agency. CVM is the Center for Veterinary Medicine, which houses the Division of Animal Feeds. Its human equivalent would be CIPSAN, which is the Center of Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. So you've got the animal feed side and the human food side. So when I say FDA or CVM, I'm referring to that center, that regulatory center. Okay, let's see here. It's always a challenge to toggle two screens. Okay, so if you're going to go to the AFCO feed ingredient route, the definition should not be proprietary because they are not to favor one ingredient producer over another. Materials to be used as a feed ingredient should have the following attributes. And remember, I said this earlier, and this is so important, that the batches need to be consistent. This feed ingredient needs to show a level of consistency. And the reason for that is because that petitioner is establishing a standard of identity, because up to that point, there really is no true standard of identity. It could be, a feed ingredient that is new, relatively new to the market, could have variabilities in it. So that's why it needs to show this consistency from batch to batch. And again, there's the standard. It should not be used to mitigate or treat or a disease. It is there for nutritional purposes only. It is the manufacturer's responsibility to produce a safe ingredient for its intended use. So if it's a food additive petition or an AFCO definition, both of those end results will result in the ingredient being published in the AFCO official publication. The AFCO official publication will include notices of a food additive petition that was successful. The AFCO OP is the most comprehensive list of approved feed ingredients. And there really is no human food equivalent to AFCO and this particular list of approved ingredients. There we go. Okay. Okay. So the AFCO and CVM have a long-standing memorandum of understanding. So we operate under an MOU with CVM. This allows FDA to accept animal feed ingredients that have come through the AFCO ingredient definition process. Because keep in mind, FDA does not technically have AFCO in their regulations. So we have this MOU in place so that FDA can accept those animal feed ingredients that come through the AFCO definition process. But with that MOU, we utilize CVM and their expertise in the Division of Animal Feed because they will review the ingredient submission packet. They are the experts. So if something is submitted through the AFCO ingredient definition route, FDA or CVM will still be reviewing that product. So even if a petitioner decides not to submit it to FDA through the food additive petition process and they want to go through AFCO, keep in mind, it still will have a level of FDA review. because that's the working relationship that AFCO and CVM have under that MOU. And we do that so that we can ensure this new ingredient has a standard of identity and that it is properly evaluated for safety and efficacy for its intended use. One thing to keep in mind, and Hunter brought this up in one of her original slides here before we lost contact with her, there was originally a push to recognize and accept hemp as an animal feed through the legislature route. There was, they evaluated whether they could change state laws to recognize hemp in animal feed. And this was viewed as kind of a quick fix to be able to get that hemp product out there in the marketplace. But it was finally evaluated enough, and enough sense prevailed, because it's not the most effective way to recognize a new feed ingredient. And I think it's because the majority of all the states, I mean, we have 50 states, they recognize a very narrow pathway for animal feed ingredients to be recognized. And if a state, let's say New York, would legislatively recognize hemp byproducts for use in animal feed, it would only be good for that state. There would be a non-uniformity between federal and state feed laws and regulations. So it really wouldn't even be fixing the problem. There would be no interstate commerce. And again, you're lacking that uniformity from state to state. So the process is set up so that the federal and the state animal feed laws and regulations will be able to recognize a new feed ingredient that comes through one of those processes. So remember, this process serves regulatory officials, it serves the regulated industry, and it serves the public by providing consistency to the animal feed ingredient approval process. So for the hemp and hemp products, there was an interest in it from the get-go with animal feed. But there are safety and efficacy concerns. Hemp may change the nutritional composition of a food-producing animals. So for instance, it may change nutritional content in eggs, it may change nutritional content in milk, or in the muscle tissue of an animal. And those are all things that are being evaluated currently to determine if it's safe for that nutritional change to occur. And keep in mind as well that even though hemp was once grown freely in the United States, it's still considered a new animal feed, and it must be evaluated for its safety and efficacy. And this is another point that Hunter had touched on. There is just a lack of information out there. There was a lack of data when all of this started coming out with the legalization of industrial hemp in the States. There just wasn't enough data to support the safe and effective use in animal feed. So to add to the newness and the uncertainty of hemp, CBD and other phytocannabinoids are extracted from the plant for dietary use in animals. So hemp seed and its byproducts, which would include hemp seed oil, do not contain measurable amounts of CBD. So hemp byproducts have a very legitimate nutritional basis for inclusion in animal feed. And I think that's what you will find is that the research is focusing on hemp seed oil, and hemp seed meal. Okay. One thing is clear through collaborative discussions with the hemp industry and the FDA, materials and products that are CBD infused need to be treated as drugs because the intended uses are largely associated with drug claims. So this means that parts of the hemp plant will not be appropriate for approval as an animal feed ingredient, but as such, products that contain CBD as a feed ingredient could be labeled adulterated or misbranded, and they could ultimately be subject to regulatory actions by state agencies. So while we're all very excited and we're discussing the research on the hemp seed oil, hemp seed meal, The concentration of the phytocannabinoids, the CBDs, the tinctures, those types of products are really not having a lot of research done for use in animal feed, because at this time, the state regulations, the federal government would very much likely view that as an adulteration, because they're including something into a feed product that is not nutritional. Its intended use is not to provide nutrition, and it really is much more of a drug claim. So it's very likely that CBDs, phytocannabinoids, will not fit the feed ingredient route. So remember, we had talked a little bit about the fact that the products that are expected to be reviewed by AFCO and CVM would include the hemp seed oil, hemp seed meal, seed cakes, and whole hemp seeds. So as a recap, remember, new feed ingredients must first be evaluated for safety and efficacy for its intended use. They must be reviewed by FDA, and regardless, either route, whether it's through the food additive petition or through AFCO, there will be FDA review of that petition with safety and efficacy. And then at that point, it must be accepted by a state agency. Hemp and hemp products are considered a source of protein, fat, fiber, and maybe even some vitamins and minerals. But again, it's for nutritional purposes. Claims to change nutritional content of food producing animals will likely require a food additive petition. And phytocannabinoids are not considered a feed ingredient. So if you have any further questions, if you are interested in discussing the process of the AFCO feed ingredient route, I threw an email up here. It's definitions@afco.org. And that is a resource account that is monitored by staff at AFCO, and they will receive your questions and they will submit them to subject matter experts that can answer questions for you. So that's a good route for just kind of that general sense of, kind of reaching out, having some general questions about new feed ingredients. If you do want more information on how to obtain the official publication from AFCO, you can, purchase it on afco.org. You can purchase a hardbound book. They also allow a subscription to an electronic version where you can use a web-based system where you can use their electronic version and do searches for feed ingredients. And if you do have any further questions on the state's position, or if you have any questions or concerns or comments, feel free to email me anytime. My email is ebubb@pa.gov. So with that, I can conclude this. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer anything at this time. I don't think there's anything in the chat.
I don't see anything, and I'm back. Thank you,
Great.
Erin, for jumping in there. I do encourage everyone to continue to add those questions in the chat. We have some great questions to start us off if you guys are feeling shy. So don't feel pressured, but I hope that there's some great content that makes you want to ask some deeper questions. So if it's okay with you guys, I was going to jump back in to my presentation, but I think this will be really seamless as we go through the process. And David, I can do screen sharing on mine. Are you just running that up to the slide I left off on?
Yeah, I'll run it and just say next slide and I'll advance.
Okay, excellent. So I would like to start on slide 6, if you can. Excellent. And so this is why I said this was a great place for me to jump in. Erin was just talking about the types of grain byproducts that we're eager to move forward, especially because of their nutritional composition. So the Hemp Feed Coalition is primarily focused on those grain and grain byproducts. Next slide for now. We are looking at the nutritional composition of pulp material, post-extracted material from flower biomass. There is not enough information to really make any decisions about that material at this time, but we're definitely looking at what other byproducts do have value in the animal feed market coming from the hemp industry. So speaking of value, next slide, please. I wanted to share some potential for the animal feed market in the United States. The best place to start is to look at production yields and to understand that really the hemp industry is just beginning in the United States. But when we talk about this grain material, another reason why we chose it is because it does have this high yield. There's an expectation of great expansion when we look at the industrial side of the hemp industry. So moving not just away from flowers, but increasing the production of fiber and grain hemp plants. Not only that, but when you look at the animal care segment, the expansion of almost 10% in the next 7 years, and this is projections from last year, is pretty attractive. You combine that with 190 million tons of animal feed produced in the United States every year, and it gives us a pretty bright future for production of hemp seed in the United States, and that we'll be able to have a market for it. Next slide. Thanks, David. So this slide is just lovely in sharing, again, some of the sector projections. Slide 9. There we go. So this is also a year old. You can see in 2019. So I'm waiting to see what kind of updates we have for this year. But again, one of the largest growing sectors that we have is actually in the animal feed industry. So again, the future is really bright. When we look at the 2020 industry update, which is the next slide, then I wanted to share with you some of the things that we've been working to move this project forward. We mentioned this incredible lack of data. So not only do we need to have nutritional and contaminant information that we use to create those standards of identity that Erin mentioned, we also have to have a much better understanding of the manufacturing processes, how that can then impact the composition of that ingredient, and how is it also being used? What's the intended use for that animal? Making sure that the nutritional composition matches that, and then identifying our principal investigators that can help us move forward in investigating the specific ingredient for that specific application and for its intended use. So that can be the concentration in the feed ration that it actually represents. So for example, we just submitted an application for hemp seed meal for laying hens for consideration to the ingredients investigator at AFCO. And that is going to include also the percentage of inclusion rates that we recommend as a protein supplement for those laying hens. The next slide shows our current projects, and I'm very excited to share this with everyone that's here today because we are working really hard to move this forward, not only in identifying research projects, but also identifying additional ingredients that we can build the standards of identity for. We're not the only ones doing this work. In fact, a lot of international organizations are currently considering standards of identity as we speak. But I'm excited to share this with you because you can see that this is a multi-state, multi-species effort that is really engaging as many individuals from processing of hemp grains and of course the producers that we can across the country. We have a land project at CSU that's funded and is happening right now. We have a rabbit study. I'm not sure if any of you are excited about rabbitry, but that's happening in Texas. We also partnered with the Wenger Group, Penn Ag, Kreider Farms, and Center for Poultry and Livestock Excellence on the laying hen application that I just mentioned. And we're moving forward, I'm very happy to say, with an equine study that's focused on oil as top dress. North Dakota State just got funded for a pilot project to look at beef cattle. And Kansas State University, some of you may be aware that they were funded with a USDA grant to look at cannabinoid transference in those products, that meat, milk, and eggs. That's going to be a critical next step in really getting the federal legal approval. So the last slide that I wanted to share today, and then I'll get us back on track, is just all the ways that you can get involved in this movement. You can become a member of the Hemp Feed Coalition. But for those of you who are producing or processing hemp ingredients, byproducts that could potentially be used as an animal feed, let me know if you're willing to share any data or certificates of analysis specifically, so that we can really understand this crop, its byproducts, and get enough data to show for certain what the standards of identity are across the United States. So I do hope that you guys have some questions towards the end. And I think that probably worked well with Erin's presentation as well. You can see that there is a lot of emphasis on research. Dave, if you want to stop sharing for me, that would be great. So that research is pivotal when it comes from species experts who are familiar not only with the animals, but the ingredient and what our goals are. That being said, I'm really excited to turn it over to Dr. Joseph Bender and listen to him and his expertise.
Sure, thanks, Hunter. Go ahead and run this for you here. Looking okay for you?
Yeah, I think so. Keep going.
Great. Okay, just checking.
There we go. There was a
we're good.
little delay. I got you now.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, thank you. Title of my talk is Considerations for Hemp as Animal Feed. And I just want to thank the committee for putting this session together and also for asking me to speak. It's been interesting to put this talk together. So just a brief outline of, I think, where we're going to go here is just looking at some general nutrition concepts, classification, animal requirements, nutrient analysis and comparison, some of the different components of hemp and the analysis, and looking at some comparative ingredients, maybe give you somewhat of a framework or a reference point, and then hemp inclusion, some of the opportunities for that. So through the talk, I'm going to try to stick to just the actual nutrition side of it, not so much of the regulatory portion, THC levels, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just going to basically stick on the nutrient profiles and how that looks in different types of animal feed. So when we classify feeds, there's really three basic boxes they're going to fit into: either a forage, which is high in fiber, and that's generally composed of the vegetative component of the plant. And that can be fed fresh. Think about grass that your horse or cow is out in pasture eating dry, such as preserved hay, wilted, or fermented in some type of silage. So we can, we kind of have our forage box that different feeds fit into it. And next is concentrates. And these are generally energy or protein dense feeds. And, for example, will be grains that are high in starch, such as corn, barley, or wheat. Then we have our protein components, high in protein, such as soybean meal or canola meal. A lot of these are byproducts. Then we have our whole seeds, which are high in fat, have a protein component, and also sometimes can have a fiber component, such as cotton seeds or whole soybeans. And then we have kind of our byproduct box, and it can be really one of several different things, being high in fiber, such as wheat midge, soy hulls, or cottonseed hulls. Again, these are all different type of byproducts. The main part of the seed was used somewhere else, generally from oil extraction, so similar to some of the hemp products. We have those that are high in pectins or sugars, like citrus pulp or the rinds from citrus waste that we can feed to animals. Then we have our high fats, candy meal or bakery waste, things that are left over from the human processing that we feed to animals. And then we kind of have this group where we lump things together, such as high protein, high fibers, and high fats. That would be distiller's grain or brewer's grain, something that's left over from the malting, usually of beverages. So, and then our last category would be the kind of the catch-all, the minerals, vitamins, and additives. So when we look through general concepts, it's really important to consider the animal that these are your feed is going to be fed to. So just saying we have a certain feed ingredient and it's high in all these things, wouldn't that be great? It's actually quite a bit more detailed than that. And part of that is understanding the physiologic states of animals. So for example, the first one we look at is maintenance. And when animals are in maintenance, there's no tissue loss or no gain. They're generally not doing anything that we consider production. So not producing milk, not laying eggs, and there's no pregnancy to support. So maintenance would really just be looking at the nutrient requirements that are adequate for an animal to go find food, to be able to digest, to be able to excrete, and then for basic movement. Anything above that requires either more intake of the feed, being able to eat more, or higher nutrient density. And that would be for growth. So animals that are growing require higher nutrients. When we start talking about animals that are making milk or laying eggs, and then lastly is pregnancy. And all these things then become additive, and that's how we determine the nutrient requirements for an animal. Diet composition, or what they're eating, is also important, and that is determined by the physiologic state. So just for example, a Holstein heifer who's being raised in confinement versus an Angus steer. A Holstein heifer, the idea is we don't want them to gain too much body condition because we don't want them to be too heavy when they start milking. An Angus steer, we're trying to put the weight onto them. So those diets are going to look different, even though they're both growing. And then your broiler versus layer diets are also going to be composed differently. And probably the last category, maybe the most important, at least when we look at agricultural uses of hemp, is feed economics. And just about every system, it's the largest cost of production, and it's also the largest cost in raising replacement animals to filter into the system. Feed is the primary driver of milk, meat, or egg production, and really it's modulated completely by management, because management has control over the quality of the feed that we're offering to the animals and also the quantity that's being offered. So the economic portion here is really, really important. And we spend a lot of time, particularly at the vet school, looking at these different feed ingredients, different cost to raise them. Because in general, animals really don't care where the nutrients come from or exactly what feed it comes from. Nutritionists or farmers do. We want to put together the most cost-effective package that we can to meet the physiologic state or the demands that's coming that our animals are requiring. So looking at some of the hemp products, there's been quite a bit of information that's been published. I'm going to try to stick to the published literature that's been published and put out there. And just a couple things that are noteworthy when you're going through this. First thing is there's a lot of variation, and that is just a lot in growing conditions, where these hemp is grown, different climates, rain yields, etc., fertilizer, all those things come into play. But there's been a few papers that are try to categorize and summary this. So first of all, looking at kind of the hemp seed in general, just a general range for the hemp seed, 20 to 25% protein, edestin and albumin being the building blocks, and then the amino acids that are present are arginine, glutamic acid, methionine, and cysteine. 25 to 35% are carbohydrates, and then 23 to 35% being the oil from the pressing or extraction. And when we talk about dry matter, these are ranges, but every plant has to add up to 100. So just keep in mind that when we say it's high in X, 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 and X, that means it has to be low, or at least we have to have room. Everything has to fit in the 100% blocks. So I keep that in the back of your mind. It can't be high in everything, but it can be certainly high, respectful to other ingredients. Then we have the hemp seed oil, roughly 90% of that being a polyunsaturated fatty acid. And this is where that fatty acid component comes into that we're especially interested in humans with the linoleic and alpha linoleic acid, the portions of those. And lastly, we have the cake seed or meal, which remains after the lipid fraction or the oil has been pressed out. And this will have a higher protein because we've made more room now for the protein, and about 10% fat. And it's just a couple graphics on your screen that shows some of the differences. There's been some different papers. Callaway, House, and Merlet looked at these. They were seeing some samples of crude protein up to 40%. That's not necessarily the norm. Again, that average kind of falls into that 20 to 25%. Looking at the whole hemp seed, 25% protein, 30% fat. And then when you take the hull off, the dehulled hemp seed, we've taken away the fiber component. So then the protein and the fat gets higher. And then this was just the snapshot from Callaway in 2004, down here in the white, looking at whole seed versus meal. The paper I'd like to reference kind of for the rest of the talk and for comparison purposes is this paper that actually came out of Kansas State. It was a short communication. It was done by Michael Kleinheitz. One of the authors in here was Steve Ensley. He was my toxicology instructor when I was in veterinary school. So I actually called and talked to him a little bit about it. So interesting group and what they're looking at. I like this paper for a couple reasons. It's fairly detailed in the methodology that they use to determine the nutrient fractions in the different plants. So this was grown at an USDA ag station in central Kansas is where these hemp plants were harvested from for this study. So just that really looked at these different, there were 7 different components of the hemp plants. So they looked at the whole plant without the roots. And then they looked at the leaves during the drying process. They looked at the stalks after the seed harvest. So we were just left with the stalks, that was what was left. They had the unprocessed female flowers prior to the oil extraction. And then we had the whole seed heads. Then there was some of the chaff that was obtained after harvesting and seed cleaning. We looked at that. And then what was left was the processed female flowers after extraction. So we had 7 different groups of hemp they were looking at. And with the final publication, don't memorize this, but this is there in the publication, and I gave you the reference here in the talk if you'd like to take a look at it. But these are all the different nutrients they quantified. So rather than go through this individually, I thought maybe I would break it apart and just go through some of the benefits of maybe some of the things that I thought were advantageous, maybe the things that can be somewhat limiting, and then tried to give you something, another feed ingredient that you could be considered maybe a similar type feed ingredient, and then some examples on how we use that, excuse me. So the first thing I looked at, I grouped the whole hemp plant and the stalks together. And that's what I have here. So just to go run through this, just a couple of things to note. First of all, very high in fiber. When you take the whole plant and process it, so if we were to go out and harvest it similar to some of our other crops, just take the whole thing and grind it up and try to feed it. This is kind of how it looked. And over here on the right, I used wheat straw as a comparative ingredient. That's kind of where it matched up. So the first thing I wanted to note is it's very high in fiber. So 80 to 85% when we look at the whole plant is fiber. And really that shouldn't be that much of a surprise when you think of how the plant looks. A fairly large plant and then the seed head. And that compares somewhat similarly to wheat straw, very high fiber component. A limiting factor of it will be the fiber digestibility. So of this fiber, how much of it is the animal readily able to digest? And we use kind of a benchmark of 30 hours. And this is a measure we use particularly in dairy cattle. After the cow eats it, what % of that is digested in 30 hours? And for the plant and the stalk, it's actually on the low side, getting back to about 30%. So of that fiber, roughly 70% of it's going to pass through the cow undigested. Compared to wheat straw, we're kind of in that same ballpark. The protein is generally lower because we have entire plant. it does have a calcium component that would be similar to really what we see in kind of some of our alfalfa silages. So where could this possibly be used? There are some applications where we actually do look to control the energy density when we feed animals, using it as a filler or something to encourage chewing, especially in cattle. So animals that we don't want to add weight to, or we want them to maintain, such as an animal that's not milking anymore and just maintaining pregnancy, this could be an option for the whole plant or the stalk. We can also use it to dry out some rations that are wet for whatever reason, or in general, I think it's what I alluded to before, transition cow diets, where we're trying to control weight gain in animals. So that would be a potential, in just my opinion, for the whole plant and the stalk, how we're going to use it. The next family to kind of look at would be the hemp leaves. And I compared it to a couple ingredients I thought was similar, kind of in the same ballpark. And beet pulp shreds would be an example. These are pretty common in dairy diets. You'll also find it in a lot of, horse feeds, for example, as a digestible source of fiber. And then grass hay compares a little bit closer to it. So first of all, the high dry matter. So this means it's very dry, only 11 to 10% of leaves were water. And to me, this is a positive. I'll touch on that in a second. Again, we have a high fiber. This is still high fiber. It's not as high as the actual stalk or the whole plant, but we're still, roughly getting close to 50% fiber. Again, the digestibility can be a factor. Can be a limitation. The digestibility is still low in this component. The samples in this paper did have a high ash component. So ash we usually think of as being a contaminant. Think about dirt getting into the field, either from processing or where it was picked up, or generally it comes from the field. So, about 20% of the sample was ash. That just kind of takes up some space. And the calcium, potassium in the hemp leaves is actually very high. Could be seen as a benefit. So some outside notes about this. The dry matter really gives you some storage options. So we can take it, we can store it somewhere, whether we bale it or we bag it, we process it somehow. It'll maintain and stay fresh. So it really gives you some options that way. This to me could be used as a forage substitute. The fiber is less limiting, although the digestibility is not quite as good as some of the other components. Still, it can definitely be used as a replacement, and really just looking at, it gives you some opportunities looking at different targets. So we'll move away kind of from the forage component and look at the hemp flower and seed heads. So now we have the whole flower, and then before the oil is extracted, and also the seed heads as well. So first of all, just to note, we're getting into these becoming higher protein. And what I use for a comparison here, I'll back up just a second. Corn germ meal, which is very popular as some type of a feed substitute ingredient, and then actually whole cotton seeds, just being a byproduct of the cotton industry. So looking, can we use the hemp flower and the seed heads as a replacement for one of those two? And yeah, really looking at a protein basis, it gets very close. We're getting into that 20% protein, which is really a nice number. When you think about a lot of the diets that you buy, whether it's for your dogs or cats or growing calves or horses, that 20% protein is a nice middle ground to hit. Although it doesn't have quite the same high fat as the complete seed head, the fat level is still fairly high. It's very comparable to something like corn or cotton seeds. So in that retrospect, it can be a positive. Again, the calcium, potassium again is pretty high, not a bad thing. And the fiber, again, we're still in that 50% fiber range. So the fiber is still pretty high. So one nice thing about when you're looking at the seed heads, the fiber component of the seed heads, now we're getting into some fiber that has some better digestibility. So we're getting into that 40%. Now this becomes comparable to some of our forages and also some of these other ingredients. So yes, now we have a component, the seed heads, that does have a high fiber component, but on top of that, we can actually really use the fiber. So that's a very positive. So these are starting to give you some more flexibility, both from a protein component and a fiber component. And the fiber levels are really getting closer to some what we see in some of our other forages. The fat is going to be a limitation. And just, for example, in growing cattle, really about 5 to 7 pounds of, a hemp flour or the seed heads is going to be a limitation because of the fat component, just especially ruminants. The fat can become a limiting factor. The rumen microbes in ruminants don't like unsaturated fatty acids. So especially mature animals, it could be a limitation. But 5 to 7 pounds, that's a fair inclusion rate. So I don't know that we go much above that to start with. And then lastly, we'll look at the hemp chaff and the flour after the oil is extracted. So looking at these, and I compare these to wheat midds, which are very popular. Wheat midds are a byproduct of the flour making industry. And then just brewer's grain after we make beer. One of the byproducts of beer making. So very popular in animal feed, especially in this area. So that's what I compared it to. And then the chaff and the extracted flour being very close on a protein basis to some of these other similar feeds. Again, the ash component was high. It'd be interesting to look into that a little bit more in the study, why it was so high. Just something to look at for not necessarily a limiting factor, but it is there. These, since the oil is removed, we still have, roughly that 3 to 5% fat. And depending on who you're looking at feeding, that might be a good thing. So this would be more ruminant friendly, in my opinion, with these fat levels. That's still fat that's going to provide energy, and it's comparable to some of our other feeds. And the calcium actually very high, looking at 5% calcium. So that could be a benefit. And then looking at the fiber digestibility, the chaff, or kind of, what's left after processing, the digestibility of the chaff is for sure being seen as a positive. Now, the interesting thing about the chaff and the extracted flour, this has characteristics that's really closest to a concentrate. Everything else before it we were kind of more towards a forage. I didn't talk about the high fiber on this slide, and that's for a reason. We're down to around 30% fiber. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but especially for the chaff, it's 30% fiber, and we're talking about roughly 50% of it being completely digestible by, a ruminant animal. So this is a real positive. This really starts checking off some of the boxes that we're looking at. So put together just a summary slide, because that was a lot to look at, and you're more than welcome to go back and look at it again if you're interested in any specifics of one of them. But just in general, when you talk about the stalk component, really high fiber, and the digestibilities, can be a limiting factor. It's not a positive attribute when you look at the plant or the stalk. Can put the leaves and just the flour together. Now we have a bigger protein component, kind of in the middle on the fiber. The fiber that's there is not as digestible. Looking at the heads and the chaff and the extracted flour, now we kind of have this middle ground of protein and fiber digestibility. And my pluses and minuses are just kind of in reference to the other components of the hemp plant, not necessarily compared to other feed ingredients. And then coming down to the fat, again, there's some of the components that were very high in fat, others that are high, but becomes more manageable. So just kind of a breakout looking at those. I thought that was a really good paper, and this to me was a different way to break it out, doing comparable. So when you think about the whole plant, that's kind of like straw. Okay, that makes sense to me. Or this, the seeds of the chaff, well, that's kind of like wheat midds or a brewer's grain. And when you look at your feed tags for your ingredients, when they talk about grain byproducts, a lot of it is distiller's grain, soy hulls, or wheat midds, etc. So to me, it would kind of fit those boxes. So looking at hemp inclusion, to me, it's dependent upon a couple things, just the animal requirements in general, the species, the production type or level, and then the system, and then really the fraction of the hemp plant that is available. So for example, the stalks and leaves, it's going to support limited growth due to the high fiber content, and the fat in the hemp seeds may impair rumen function. So just being careful on how that fits into your diet. And the next is going to be the economics, the cost of the hemp. So all these things have to be factored into it. The seed, if there's any chemicals used, any fertilizers, land rent, equipment, labor, and then really your cost to raise the product is a function of the inputs and then the yield you get off of it. So Hunter talked about that before, roughly 800 pounds of seeds per acre. So you just have to figure out what was your cost to raise that acre and then, divide it by the yield. And then cost efficiency, the combination of nutrient profiles and the cost to maximize that feed efficiency. So this is kind of a busy slide, but just really want you to look at the bottom. There's 3 different trials here that we ran, and this is for a dairy cow to make 90 pounds of milk. And here's just all the inputs into one of our models for pricing. So for example, the first iteration we looked at was hemp pellets, and let's just say for an example, they cost $100 a ton to raise. All right, well then we formulated a diet then, and it used these ingredients listed along here. And when hemp was $100 a ton, it took 5 pounds per day of the hemp pellets. That was the cheapest, most efficient way to feed the animal. All right. When hemp pellets were $150 a ton, it only included right around a half pound of the hemp pellets. There was other feeds in these examples that made more economic sense. When the cost became the hemp pellets were $175 a ton, it didn't include them at all. So these diets that we looked at, and this was just a cow, when we had hemp pellets at $100 a ton, we could feed that animal for $4.23 a day. When it was $150 a ton and we included half a pound, it was $4.36. So that's the difference. And then when the hemp pellets were more expensive, it was right around $4.37. So we're still meeting the same requirements for the animals, just in this situation, when the hemp pellets were cheaper, it pulled more of them into the diet and then replaced something else. So just kind of an example, looking at that 436 versus 423, or the change in the price of the hemp pellets, that's 13 cents per head per day. So a dairy farmer milking 100 head of cattle, coming out somewhere around $5,000 a year. And that's just across 100 cows. So that's kind of the economic component of looking at it, and where the hemp pellets come into. So, so just kind of my final thoughts on this, the inclusion of the feed characters, there's positive and negatives to the hemp and different parts of it. That's similar to many feeds. We're looking at all these different feeds and their different attributes and then putting them together to make a diet. And it's very dependent on animal dependent, who and when. Economics, the cost of production is going to drive inclusion. In Pennsylvania, we're in a concentrate negative area. We have the animals here, but we pull in a lot of concentrates from the Midwest. So if we can replace some of these purchased feeds that we're getting with a homegrown hemp substitute, that's always very positive. And again, especially in southeastern Pennsylvania, or just on the East Coast in general. So yeah, I thank you for your attention. It's kind of a lot of information, but the summary slides, I think, hopefully will be helpful if you can go back and look at that. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Bender. That was fantastic data that you just presented. It definitely, I have some questions, but this isn't just my opportunity to ask questions. So we'll see what other questions we have. But we did get a question from Randy, or I'm sorry, not Randy, Rodney. Welcome, Rodney, and thank you for putting your question in. Erin, I'm going to pose this to you. Rodney's question is, a Pennsylvania egg company recently announced a hemp egg. How would they produce a hemp egg if hemp has not been approved as a feed ingredient?
Okay. Yes. So hemp is being used in feeding trials. There is a rather large feeding trial that is underway. We understand that it's still in the research phase, and any of those resulting eggs should not be in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I just want to add a little bit to that, because you alluded in your presentation earlier that just getting the ingredient approved on the safety and efficacy side, does not automatically grant approval for the animal products that result from those animals being fed hemp. I think that's a great place to provide some clarity. So Rodney, I do really appreciate that question. And I know for myself, it's frustrating as we're developing good data on the ingredient side, then we still have to wait to do all the safety assessments to show not only is it safe to feed to the animals, but then as Erin mentioned, a feed additive petition is going to be necessary to gain approval for those animal products. Excellent. So definitely let me know if you guys have any questions to throw into the chat. I will be watching for those as we move through the rest of the presentation. Dr. Bender, I wanted to ask specifically, you did a great job looking at the economics and really breaking down the potential of hemp as animal feed. Can you provide some suggestions as far as the type of hemp byproducts that you think have the greatest potential to be included in animal feed?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a good question. To me, I was looking at that summary slide I had together, and I think when you start looking at after we've extruded the oil, and we start to lower the fat content, particularly for especially for ruminants, that's going to be a huge that makes it much more manageable to work with. The high fat becomes limiting, especially for ruminants. I think I said that a few times. The chaff to me was very interesting. So, I mean, really, it's like a complete waste product. So just kind of putting that in perspective, when you think about how we process soybeans or, you know, how we end up with soybean meal, canola is the same way. We remove the oil and then what we're left with. So that's probably going to be the biggest opportunity. And some of those ingredients compare very similar to some of the more what we call the traditional byproducts. And boy, if we can use it as a byproduct, then it doesn't go to a landfill. And I mean, that to me is a really key component. You know, 30 to 40% of our animal diets, you know, can be classified into that. What they eat is considered a byproduct, would otherwise go to a landfill if it didn't go to an animal. And just, you know, just a huge win for environmental sustainability. So kind of the bottom fractions I had on that graph, the seeds, particularly after the oil has been removed, and then I think, you know, just even the chaff. And those things can be pelleted. And I think that's where some of the research is going. And that's probably going to make the most economic sense then also. So it's a good question. Thank you.
Excellent. And I'm very excited anytime that we can create secondary streams of revenue for our producers, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Excellent. And Erin, this is a question that I get asked all the time, and I think it's appropriate to circle back a little bit when we were talking about those hemp-fed eggs. And can you talk about the difference between grass and the rest of the approval process, I guess, trying to kind of separate what generally regarded as safe means, and specifically, how can we use something that's grassed versus something that's actually gone through the approval process?
Sure. So I even said today in my presentation that I really wasn't going to spend much time talking about grass, which is generally regarded or generally recognized as safe, because quite honestly, with the hemp products, there's going to be a good bit of safety data that needs to be evaluated. You know, and Hunter talked about even the end product, you know, the human food product that is resulting from the production animals that are being fed these hemp products should go through some level of evaluation by FDA due to the changes in their nutrient content. Now, grass, there is such an option. It's a federal rule, quite honestly, and they do allow a food item, a food product, to be independently evaluated. There's an independent conclusion grass result that can occur with the proper level of research and analysis, and a sponsor can make that determination. They can make a self-affirmed independent conclusion grass of a food product or of a feed ingredient for that intended use. There's a trick to it though, in that just as much research and evaluation is needed on an independent conclusion grass that an AFCO ingredient definition or a food additive petition would need. It's really not an easier route. And the one thing about it is that particular sponsor or the petitioner who does the self-affirmed grass, it's allowing it for that one use. It's very specific, and it may not be recognized from state to state. And that's one of the biggest hurdles, is that is not going to be an automatic inclusion for interstate commerce. It's going to still very much limit the distribution of that product. It's going to still limit the use of that product. And because you're using it in food producing animals, has that evaluation been made on the resulting products, on the milk, on the eggs, on the animal tissue? And I'm just using those as examples. So yes, grass can be determined. I think in this situation, my world, we look at animal feed ingredients. So you can make an independent conclusion grass, generally recognized as safe for hemp seed oil or hemp seed meal. But again, it's going to be limited, and it's going to really narrow down that field of available legal use. So again, like Hunter, like we've been saying, the broad approval process, we've talked about a bit more today, because that's really going to be the route that we see these hemp products. And that's what Hunter is rallying. That's what she's trying to take all of this independent research that's being done, and growers and producers and Hunter's that point person that's trying to wrangle all of that, and put it into an appropriate petition submission for these types of uses for a very broad recognition and use. Does that help?
I think so. I think one other aspect that I would just add to this is, and I think you mentioned this, is that the grass applications are generally self-affirmed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the other reality is that they're not approved. Rather, the FDA CVM comes back and says that they have no questions or concerns. So those are very different words when we talk about actually gaining federal approval. So a grass notification does not actually lead to federal approval, right, Erin?
That's correct. And again, like I said, it is an option, and we always want to make sure people understand it, but it's extremely limited. It's very narrow, and it does not automatically indicate that you've got interstate federal support of that particular grass.
Absolutely. And I just would add that for anyone that's considering a grass notification, Erin mentioned this as well, it's an incredible amount of energy, data, and resources. And from my perspective in looking at grass applications, it's not much different from going forward with the feed additive petition and just making that commitment. Excellent. All right. So we did just get another question in our chat. Thank you, Tom. So could animal feed eventually become a viable market on its own for hemp growers? Is there potential for growers to raise hemp strictly for animal feed, or will always be a side market for hemp byproducts? Dr. Bender, did you want to respond to this?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, really good question. What's going to determine if it's a viable market, just raising it for feed, is really going to be the cost to raise it. Because the nutrient value is there. Again, I think I said in my talk, there's positive and negative. So it's going to become, you may not want to feed, it may not be an option for you if you're looking at milking very high producing dairy cows. It may be an option looking at growing some steers or something like that. It has to fit into, but really it's going to come down to getting it to be very competitive from a cost input wise, getting the cost, and then that actually dilutes down by the yield. So it's going to have to be able just to be raised as a feed. It's going to have to get competitive with some of our other things such as corn, or alfalfa or soybeans. So the potential is definitely there. And I think back, if you go back and look at some of the data, just the improvements that we've made in some of our other crops, particularly corn or soybeans, we get on this upward trajectory of, as genetics get better, as the breeding of the plants get better, we're able to improve yield. And I would think there would be some opportunity to look at hemp just as an animal feed. Do we really need, really big, heavy stalks to hold, the seed head? Because that's what makes, hurts the digestibility. So just some examples. Just the quality and ability of animals to eat some of our other feeds continues to improve. And I would think hemp would probably get on that same trajectory. Will kind of be some takeaways from that. So yeah, I certainly think it can be competitive. We'll have getting the research into it and getting on the same plane as some of these other products will be critical. Hope
Yeah, it's all about that research, isn't it? All right, so I think we have time for one more quick question, and my intention was to end on this question, and Erin, this one is for you as quickly as you can, but why is it, after all of the millennia of us growing and feeding hemp to ourselves and our animals, why is, even after legalization, is it still considered a new animal feed ingredient?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I get that question a lot. And I think it came as a general surprise to a lot of people when we started seeing industrial hemp back into the marketplace. It was, well, this would have been fed long ago. So why can't we do it now? And I think the one thing we have to remember is it was so long ago, much of that data is not available. There just is not that much safety data. Yes, we are aware anecdotally that hemp products were fed to farm animals, to livestock, and I think that's understood, but we aren't sure about their formulations at the time. Nutrition has changed a bit. The use of the use of the high production, the high production animal, feeding with maybe potentially a higher formulation of these hemp products in their animal feed than what would have been produced at one time, or would have been added to their feed at one time. And I think also too, perhaps these hemp varieties are a little different than they were back in 1900 or 1890 or what have you. They're being bred right now for higher levels of the phytocannabinoids, and potentially that's an unknown. So I think that we had to start back at square one. We had to show through research that these products are safe for the intended use in food producing animals. And that's it. Unfortunately, it, like I said, it caught everybody back at square one.
It absolutely did. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you, but I'm also posting my email address in the chat. This emphasis on data and research is so important to moving this forward. So please let me know if any of you have data to share or if you have more questions. I did want to take a minute and thank everyone for your participation. Let's give our speakers a round of applause for sharing their expertise. Thank you, everyone.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
I appreciate being on this panel with Erin and Dr. Bender. Before we leave, I just want to take a quick moment to recognize our top level sponsors and partners for this year's Pennsylvania Hemp Summit: Lancaster Farming, King's Agri-Seeds, Pennsylvania Agricultural Business Development Center, and Air Products. Please take a moment to fill out our session surveys. It's a key feature of the summer summit. Our platform will remain open for 30 days. Recordings of the sessions are available next week on the platform. And I hope you continue to use this platform to connect with each other throughout the day and to begin to help us make plans for the summit in 2021. Again, do those surveys. Thank you so much for attending today. And thank you, Dr. Bender and Erin. I appreciate your expertise.
Thank you, Hunter.
You bet. Thank you for moderating. Great job.